good evening. I've got it right this time. Welcome to the panel. We're very glad for you all to be here. So the question is, we get started right away because we're running short for time. How did Islam really begin? And so I'm just going to get straight into it. The question then is, what is Mecca? Odon.
What is Mecca?
According to Islam.
According to Islam, it's supposed to be the birthplace of Muhammad. It's supposed to be the place where God sent Adam, the first man, to build the first temple. And it's also supposed to be the place where Abraham and his son Ishmael rebuilt Adam's first temple. But I have other things to say about Mecca.
And we'll get to that. But these are the things that Muslims will traditionally say, correct?
Yeah, I think so. They will also add many more details because the Islamic narrative is stuffed with stories about Meccans, pagan Meccans, and Muhammad, his family, his background, and so there's a whole world. It's like a lore, like Tolkien's Lords of the Ring or Star Wars. There's a whole universe of stories that has been created to give background to Mecca in the Islamic narrative.
But there's been recent scholarship since at least the 70s with John Wansborough, who've started finding issues with the history of Mecca, such as Patricia Croner, one of John Wansborough's students. And particularly what she found was, I believe, a missing Mecca on the maps.
Yeah, she found that there is no mention of an ancient city, absolutely no mention. But she also found that it was not possible for the Meccan trade that is described in the Islamic narrative to have taken place from Mecca. Mecca is completely unfit for being a caravanserai, a basis for such a trade. You cannot breed cattle, you cannot breed camels in Mecca. There is no water in Mecca for a settlement, a substantial settlement. So there is something very, very wrong in the Islamic narrative about Mecca. It cannot have happened there.
So we're seeing a problem with the basis for Mecca, that there isn't a foundation in terms of resources, like very fundamental resources for Mecca. That's what we're seeing. So, Jay, you've talked about this before. You've talked about the geographical issues, specifically on your YouTube, particularly when it comes to Patricia Croner and the maps, and the latest findings about trade route and agriculture, and also the missing Mecca from the external sources, the Roman and the Greek sources. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Well, I'm going to be talking about that this evening, so I'm going to hold off on that because I'm going to do what he did. Esoterically, I'm going to put it in comic book fashion. I'm just going to show you picture after picture, slide after slide, and show you exactly what he's been saying, how easy this is, because you cannot find Mecca anywhere, folks. Here's the problem. If there was a Mecca, if it's that old, if Adam and Eve were there, that means it's the oldest city in history, right? Am I correct? There's no one older than Adam and Eve. Just say yes. Of course. If Abraham was there, according to chapter 21 of the Qur'an, and he was there rebuilding the Kaaba, then he lived in 1900 BC. If this was a center of trade, north, south, east, or west, why is it no one's ever heard of this place? Ptolemy, who did the maps, you talk about the maps, look at Ptolemy's Geography of Arabia. He has all the other little towns everywhere, but he's missing the most important town, Mecca. And it's not Makaraba. You can tell me Makaraba is it's the wrong Arabic, isn't it? It's the wrong three letters. Just say yes. Can you see the problem, folks? You cannot find it anywhere. If this is such a great place, why is it all these other insignificant towns like Najran and Taif and Yathrib and Khaybar and Tabuk and all these other significant towns that no one really cares about are found all through the historical documentation, but the most important city, the city that is the greatest city in the history of mankind, which is the first city in the history of mankind, there is not a word, not until 741. And that's 100 years after Muhammad.
And that's a great segue because, Robert, we talked about this earlier, about why is it we only see an explicit mention of Mecca in 741 AD in the Byzantium Arabica, I believe. And why is that damaging? Why is that damaging?
Well, it's clear that until the Abbasid period, there was no pilgrimage to Mecca. And it's only, from the 750s onward, there starts to emerge a pilgrimage to Mecca, but not before that. And the later Abbasid chroniclers, they criticized the Umayyads for having diverted especially Abd al-Malik, for having diverted the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which is away from Mecca. But you have the impression that they're criticizing him because he didn't know there was a pilgrimage to Mecca yet.
Yeah, that's interesting. And just to go further on that with you, it's interesting how many other cities around Mecca are mentioned, many other little towns, little spots, and yet Mecca is still not mentioned. Even civilizations, we have access to their records and they don't make a mention of them.
Well, you have to be careful because the non-attestation of something doesn't prove the non-existence of something. It just means it wasn't, so if you look with Ptolemy's map, he doesn't mention all towns everywhere. I think Mecca was a backwater, as I mentioned this afternoon. It was probably the site of pilgrimage for Ismail and Hagar. But that means it was just a pilgrimage shrine. It wasn't a city, it wasn't a town, it was just a sacred site, nothing big. And just with Makoraba, that was Gibbon's idea from the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. But there's one thing that one has to remember with Ptolemy's maps is they didn't yet have longitude. So when Ptolemy starts moving away from the Mediterranean, things become skewered. So Makoraba, according to Ptolemy, it's on the mouth of a river or a wadi, which is Mecca isn't certainly. It's a site in Yemen, but that's another discussion. And yeah, to invent the phonetic changes from Makoraba to Mecca, you'd have to be very creative.
Paul, your opinion on Makoraba and its reference as Mecca?
I don't have any specialist insight into Makoraba, but for Mecca, I think so far we've underplayed it. According to the traditional narrative, Muhammad was born and raised in Mecca. He gave the best years of his life to fighting to capture Mecca, and he made it the focal point of his religious mission. Then Abu Bakr inherited his realm, and Abu Bakr was born and raised in Mecca. And then Umar, who was born and raised in Mecca. And then Uthman, who was born and raised in Mecca. And then Ali, and then Muawiyah, all born and raised in Mecca. These 5 individuals established an empire that stretched by the end of Muawiyah's reign from Libya through to Central Asia, heading towards the border of the Ganges. A huge, huge empire, all raised and based by people who were born and raised in Mecca, and yet no one's heard of Mecca. It's unbelievable. If it is possible that there was a sleepy little backwater at Mecca, leave aside how they managed to field an army of 10,000 people, but if it was possible, it's no way it could have remained anonymous that by 741 or 743, the Byzantine Arabic Chronicle says we don't really know where this Mecca is, but we think maybe it's somewhere in Mesopotamia. It's just not possible that they could have been that ignorant for that long if the story was true.
Okay. So the basis for Mecca would be, its history. It hinges on, the basis of the caliphs you were talking about. Because so much of the tradition says they were born and raised, it just ups the ante. Mecca needs to be a solid and historical place to support the growth and emergence of Islam. But for that, you need water. And for that, you need fertile soil and all these types of things. So Jay, I know you love to talk about the Zamzam well, for example, because any civilization, the first thing they need is water. Could you speak more on that?
No, I don't want to speak. I want Chris to do this because actually Chris actually knows the answers to this one.
Please go ahead, Chris.
We've only got one microphone between us. We had to share, you know. Oh, there we go. Got it.
You can hug, you know.
I think I might strangle Mel by accident with this, but what's interesting is, yeah, I could talk about Zamzam well. A lot of the information that I got from the Zamzam well, in all honesty, came from Mel, which is quite interesting. So this is me kind of talking on his behalf a little bit. But the Zamzam well, practically speaking, we know is infinite, for one thing. Supposedly the Zamzam well, which is based in Mecca, which is, according to tradition, it goes back to stories of Ishmael and looking for water and Hagar and some things and things like that. We know, though, that this supposed deposit of water is just completely natural. There's nothing supernatural about it at all. It has limits to it, and we have long encroached on those limits. If you think about the modern day, there are many people who travel to Mecca for Hajj, millions and millions, and they need water because in Saudi Arabia, for most of the seasons, it's incredibly warm and hot. And so for this reason, since there isn't much water around Mecca at all, you have to import water from other places. Why is it the case that in today, Mecca is importing water from Jeddah, which is a city to the west, through desalination plants that are all based along the Red Sea, that are converting salt water using electricity into fresh water to then pump it back straight into the Kaaba so that Muslims who are doing Hajj can have a nice glass of water. They're doing this because the Zamzam well isn't unlimited, it is very much limited. And why is it that when they go through this process, when they actually do take out some of the Zamzam water, because they've now built big sort of extraction machines to get it out there as much as they can, and then they can process it, the Zamzam water is processed, it goes through a procedure in which they ensure that it isn't contaminated. There's actually been cases of people who took Zamzam water before they ever did this, and they took it to different places around the world, and they made people ill because there was issues with the Zamzam water. According to tradition, the Zamzam water is meant to be some sort of miracle cure for things. Muslims crave Zamzam well because they believe that it has these properties that can heal people. So why are they processing it through these plants to make sure it's safe for consumption? The answer is there's nothing at all in any sense amazing or miraculous about the Zamzam well. And also it's limited and they can't feed that many people at all, not the amount of people you need to make Mecca the city of the mother city, the city of Adam and Abraham. Nowhere near enough water from the Zamzam well.
The mother of all cities, according to Islam. Mel, since Chris got a lot of his information from you, would you like to add on to any of that?
Yeah, well, Chris has really much covered everything. I think the interesting thing about Zamzam is the name, because there is a Chinese source called Du Huan who visited the entire area in the 750s, and he refers to the belief of the Zamzam, which is very similar, which is identified by a number of sources as Zoroastrian. So it does raise the question, is this well related to Zoroastrianism, which is possible. But there's also the big issue that if you look at the traditions around the Zamzam well and the Kaaba, and then you look at the Qur'an, and it's very clearly a Judeo-Christian text, there seems to be a mismatch. It does give the impression that it is part of accretions that occurred over time, rather than this standard Islamic narrative would have you believe that the bottom foundation is paganism and then all the other bits were added on. But it does look to me that actually the pagan elements are add-ons that came later. And we don't know the full picture of how that happened, but that would be the impression I get.
Okay. Robert, you had something?
No, so if you even look at the Islamic accounts of Zamzam, it's interesting because it's forgotten about, even according to the Islamic tradition. So it's a well with Hagar, and then it's forgotten about. and all of a sudden it's Muhammad's grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, who re-digs out the well, because it's, what's the word? It's blocked. It's blocked, it's no longer functioning as the well. According to the Islamic tradition, it's the grandfather of Muhammad who rediscovers it and finds treasure in it. This is, of course, a literary topos, which we also find in the first book of Maccabees, which would then be another indication for Jerusalem of digging up an old well and finding a sword and all kinds of treasure. So it seems to be a biblical topos transplanted to Jerusalem, because, as you were saying with the water, they'd forgotten about that, even according to the Islamic tradition, which I don't think is historical, but they mention it had been forgotten about.
Mm-hmm. So here's a question for the panel. Obviously, water is the basis of any civilization, but as you mentioned before, the Islamic claim was that it was a sanctuary and a place of pilgrimage, and obviously a place of pilgrimage needs a religious site. And according to Muslims, the site at Mecca was obviously the Kaaba, and all Qiblas in the world point to the Kaaba. However, Dan Gibson's recent Qibla findings prove, potentially, that Mecca couldn't have been a sanctuary until 727 AD. Is that true? A question for the panel. Anyone? Why has Dan Gibson's recent Qibla findings proven that Mecca couldn't have been a sanctuary until 727 AD?
You go ahead, then I'll just jump into this. Yeah, I think with Dan Gibson, Dan did us a great favor in actually going to every one of these Qiblas. And remember, he went to over 100 Qiblas. David King, who's supposed to be the world's authority on it, only went to one. I would suggest that maybe David should have listened to what Dan was saying. But here's the thing. The Qiblas, they're not mosques. These were Nabatean temples, so they predated. So it stands to reason that they were facing Petra, because that's the city of tombs and temples, and that's where they're buried, and so it makes sense. It makes sense. The difficulty is, where is there any Qibla? Qibla, for those who don't know what I'm talking about, is a direction of prayer. Where is there any of these temples, or what later become mosques, to Mecca? Why is it that up until 706, every Qibla is facing Petra, and it's not till 715? If Muhammad died in 632, you're talking over 100 years, almost 100 years later, there's the first one that finally faces Mecca. So that's the difficulty. I don't really care about whether or not Petra is important. That's not important to me. What's more important is, why isn't Mecca at the center of all these direction of prayers?
With the mention of, actually, sorry, let me open it up to the panel. Anyone else would like to speak on that?
Just make a comment about maybe rather stepping on Robert's toes, but as Robert mentioned earlier on in one of his talks, Mecca now, the Kaaba, itself has a Qibla. It's not the center of its own religious landscape. It has a Mecca, and it has a Qibla, and anyone can do this. Robert mentioned it, but I've done it. Anyone can do it on their mobile phones now. Go in on Google Earth, look at the Kaaba, look at the curved wall around the Hatim, follow that line, and it leads straight to Temple Mount in Jerusalem. You go to Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and what do we find? The Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock does not have a Qibla. It is clearly designed for people to walk around the stone that is the center of the landscape. The other way. But you go round and round and round the stone. It's about circumambulating the summit of Mount Moriah. The Kaaba itself speaks, and it speaks that Jerusalem is the center, not that Jerusalem has a Qibla toward the Kaaba.
Well.
Yeah, so there are problems with using the Qibla data, we should point out, because it depends a lot on whether you've dated the buildings, so you can't really draw too strong a conclusion. But even if you trust the buildings and their dating, the issue is you don't find Qiblas to Mecca prior to, say, the 720s. Now, if you look at the inscription evidence, you don't see Muhammad appearing widely in inscriptions till the 730s. The first mention of something like the current story of Muhammad, it doesn't appear in Chinese sources that are given by invoice from the Taiyaye to the Tang court until the 750s. So it seems like the
Mel,
story...
say why it's important that the Chinese are important. Why you bring that in?
So the reason why that's important is because you have two envoys that travel to the Chinese, and the Chinese, of course, put it in their records, put it away. They're not really interested, but they just store it away. It's not contaminated. But in 651, when the envoys went there, they tell a story of how, not Islam, but how the kingdom started, let's call it. There's no mention of Muhammad, there's no mention of Muslims, there's no mention of mosques or anything that you'd imagine to do with Islam. They talk about a Persian man, there's a lot of mythological elements to it, but it talks about a Persian man who gets weapons and essentially creates a separatist regime. Then you go forward in time to 756, 758. Now the Chinese get this other report from, again, the Taiyaye envoys. Now suddenly there's a reference to what seems to be a rendering of Muhammad, but it's Mokomo in Chinese. And now you have, instead of the Taiyaye being mentioned, now you have the Quraysh being mentioned, and you have other elements like the core element of this standard Islamic narrative, but it's very minimal.
Can I just say one thing? Mel, one of the things that you bring out an awful lot is the reason why the Chinese things are important because they are completely distinct from the Abbasids. They could not have been destroyed. This is another material that it has not had any working on it. That's what's different, and that's why it's important that we do look at that.
Odom, you had something to say?
Yeah, about the Qibla, there is also something very interesting in the Qur'anic material. There are mentions to the Qibla in the Quran, and it's been interpreted in the Islamic narrative as a change. You know the story. Muhammad at first was ordered to pray toward Jerusalem, and God ordered him to change the Qibla, the direction of prayer, towards Mecca. But actually, if you really look into
Tabari.
it...
Tabari.
In Tabari?
Tabari mentions this.
Tabari mentions this, but it's in the Quran. It's Tabari's interpretation. It has become standardized in the Islamic narrative. When you look at what the Quran actually says, the preacher talks to people who are praying towards the heaven, who are orienting toward the west or the east. This looks a lot like Christians praying to the east, to the rising sun, the Christian tradition of prayer. And he urges them to change this tradition. He says the east and the west belong to God, so pray towards the Masjid al-Haram. Masjid al-Haram is supposed to be, according to the Islamic narrative, the sanctuary of Mecca, but it also refers to Jerusalem's temple, the Temple Mount. It is also a Masjid al-Haram.
Robert, would you like to respond?
No, just a few brief points. So firstly, with the problem, archaeologically speaking, with the Qiblas, is what is a mosque in the 7th century and are there mosques in the 7th century?
That is Masjid.
Masjid. No, but even archaeology. So what usually happens with excavations on an Arab site, like at Amman or something, you find a room in a complex that has a niche in it, and if it points south, it's considered a congregational mosque. But it has no evidence because, of course, according to the Islamic tradition, mosques, masjid, are undecorated, unlike churches. Therefore, you don't need decorations. Therefore, it's proven. So there is a huge problem with what is a mosque in the 7th century. The thing is, Tabari mentions this in great detail, that Muhammad gets this change of prayer direction, and that they hang up signs in the mosque saying, pray now this way. But the point is, I would even contest that, because the only evidence we have for the Qibla and the change of a direction of prayer is in Surah 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, 145, thank you. And we have Kibla, but does this mean, and this is a problem that we have with Quranic exegesis with Arabic. When you read Arabic in the Quran, everything has a different meaning, which is a problem. And if you look in Semitic languages, Kabbalah is usually something you do face to face. So we all know Kabbalah with Madonna, Jewish esotericism. But what it's used for actually in Judaism is revelations made to Moses, also the oral Torah, outside of the Torah. So everything, the prophets, the writings, the Mishnah, Talmud. You know, the Assyrians, they were a warlike people, so Kabbalah, Kabalu there, it means to fight, you know, arm-to-arm combat. And in Arabic, Kabbalah in the second stem can of course mean to kiss, you know, something you do face-to-face. But Kabbalah, I think in the Surat al-Baqarah, Surah 2, it doesn't necessarily mean direction of prayer. I would suggest it means previously revealed scriptures, but traditions, yeah. And it has nothing to do with the change in the direction of prayer. And it is, of course, originally to the north, to Jerusalem, or to the east that you prayed.
There is
any response?
something
One more response.
in the Quran that is very, very odd. When, according to the Islamic narrative, so maybe Tabari, when Muhammad is ordered to change the direction of prayer, there is something with the Jew. He's supposed to be in Medina, and he tells...
It's after the Jews refused to accept
exactly
the revelation.
But what the heck? Why Jews would be compelled to speak to pray towards Mecca? Actually, when you look at the verse, Muhammad tells the Jews, you have your Qibla, I have mine. You have your tradition, I have mine. Isn't this because the actual Qibla, the Qibla that is mentioned literally in the Quran, is not a Qibla toward Mecca, but toward Jerusalem? And this concerns Jews, because they were praying toward Jerusalem, and when Muhammad changes the direction from the rising sun to Jerusalem, he explains his followers, you will be praying like Jews toward Jerusalem, but beware, we have our own reasons to do so. They do this because of their Kabbalah, their traditions. You do this because you are my followers, and you pray toward Jerusalem for other reasons as Jews. You are not like Jews.
Well, this is a nice segue to Paul for your Jerusalem thesis, which you posted. So there's lots of mention of Jerusalem and Qibla direction, and I believe you wrote something on Jerusalem thesis. Would you like to explain what that is?
Yes, well, just dealing with this point, there are two passages in the Quran where the place it's focused on, the Masjid al-Haram, is compared with somewhere else. One is where the Qibla is changed, so they were praying towards one place and then they pray towards Mecca. The other place is the night journey, where God's messenger is carried from the Masjid al-Haram to the Masjid al-Aqsa for the furthest place of prostration. I find it very interesting that in the only two places where the Masjid al-Haram is compared with somewhere else, the other place is Jerusalem. There's no reason in the text to say why that is. There's no reason for thinking that Jerusalem is the furthest place of prostration. It doesn't mean anything. And nobody in the ancient world would have said, if you had to describe Jerusalem, or say it's somewhere it's far, far away. It was a center of the world from the ancient perspective. And with the changing of the Qibla, the Quran says you found it difficult to pray towards Jerusalem. But there's no reason why any of the believers of the early Quran would have found it difficult to pray to Jerusalem, since it is so heavily embedded in biblical stories and themes and characters. Why would somebody have found it difficult to pray to Jerusalem? I find that the reason the narrative just keeps shoehorning Jerusalem in there is because it was always Jerusalem. They've switched the narrative so that instead of a journey away from Jerusalem, it becomes a journey to Jerusalem, and instead of changing the Qibla from praying to Jerusalem, is now changing the Qibla to praying towards Jerusalem.
Well, this is just an example of the conflicting Islamic traditions, because if you look at the different Arabic sources, you know, some say Muhammad originally prayed towards the Kaaba, some say he prayed towards Jerusalem, and then there are those that say when he was in Mecca, he prayed with the Kaaba and Jerusalem in line, which makes little sense, because why wouldn't you just pray at the Kaaba? But it's of course Jerusalem, and the Masjid al-Haram is the Temple Mount at Jerusalem, and it has nothing to do with the Kaaba originally. It has become secondarily the Kaaba in Mecca.
Well,
Just to add to that, I think the two other elephants in the room is Safa and Marwa. So you have Josephus 2,000 years ago referring to a particular hill in Jerusalem as Safa, and then Moriah is where the Temple mounted. Moriah in Arabic is Marwa. So I think that's important. It's evidence that they've transposed biblical material about Jerusalem, put it down to Mecca. Conveniently, it's a blank slate. You can create your Las Vegas in the desert and build a whole new narrative around that. New York, yeah.
Chris, we talked about the Jerusalem thesis earlier. What are your thoughts?
I don't think I have too much to add to that. I'm still sort of trying to piece things together. I mean, it seems like it makes sense that this is originally talking about Jerusalem, and then it's then been changed over the course of time to refer to a new place that can, theologically, they can attach new things to that can help make a standard Islamic narrative. So I agree with what's been said.
Well, let me push the question further. How does this discredit Mecca? How about that?
So we've already talked about a few problems with Mecca and some of the things that are said about it. But I think this basically shows that Mecca has been a tool for a grander idea that comes later than the original accounts. So what happened originally has a lot more to do with groups that are looking towards Jerusalem and thinking with Jerusalem in mind than Mecca. In fact, we see very little reason at all to think Mecca is in any way involved in this. So, yeah.
Robert.
No, I would. So as I said, if you look at the Arabic sources and you try to piece them together, so for example, Al-Arzaki in his Akbar Makkah mentions that when Hagar was supposedly running back and forth looking for water, she is saved by the local tribe of Makkah, which is called the tribe of Keturah. So those of you who know your book of Genesis know that after Sarah dies, Abraham marries again to Keturah. And according to the Jewish tradition, Keturah is Hagar, because, well, there's theological reasons for that. But there is a memory.
You're talking about Ishmael.
Pardon?
You're talking about Ishmael.
Yeah, about Ishmael. And this is why I would say that with the later in the Abbasid period, the Mecca becoming the holy site of is what's becoming Islam makes sense. Because I said, if it's the site of the pilgrimage for Hagar and Ishmael, because all biblical figures had pilgrimage shrines in the antique world, at least since St. Helena, and we don't have it anywhere else. But it would make perfect sense for something that's becoming Islam to choose this site as their holy site. Jerusalem is too occupied by other Christians and by Jews. And if you say we're the descendants of Abraham through Ishmael, the firstborn, the true inheritant, well, it makes perfect sense to choose the pilgrimage site of this person as your holy place. And so you're the biological and the spiritual descendants, Tawheed, of Abraham.
Jay, what are we missing? What else? How else does Jerusalem discredit Mecca?
I'm not so really interested in that question. I want to go on to Muhammad now, if you don't mind.
Okay.
I think we've pretty well shut down Mecca. Here's the big question, and this is it. If you shut down Mecca, then what Muhammad are you talking about?
And if you shut down Muhammad, what revelation are you talking
First
about?
answer that one first. If you shut down Mecca, what then happens to Muhammad? Go ahead, guys. Who is Muhammad, and did he exist?
Well, if you throw out Muhammad, if you throw out Mecca, all the biographical information connected with Muhammad has to be nonsense. There is no story. And if you have no story, it undermines the case for its reliability, I would say. But I'll pass it on.
Or at least everything has been redacted.
I just want to
Mecca
say,
has been added.
absolutely. What I would say is the Quran itself isn't explained. It's not a self-explained book. It might try and say it is, but it isn't. There are clearly parts that make no sense when you just look at them as a standalone text. Muslims traditionally understand the Quran through the Sirah and the Hadith material, so the Sunnah. But if Mecca isn't real, it wasn't really the actual place they say it is, that undermines the entire accounts. And if you undermine the accounts, what are you going to do with the Quran? How do you explain the Quran if the accounts you already know are wrong? You end up basically with a semi-meaningless revelation, and the Quran becomes redundant.
Well, if you just read the Quran, then you have to ask yourself, even in translation, then you have to ask yourself how this revelation to a Muhammad would have worked. Because, if you read a prophetic book of the Old Testament and compare it with the Quran, and how is the Quran supposed to work as a revelation? Because what is being actually revealed? It's just a question. But with Muhammad, if there is no Mecca, well, none of these guys can come. I mean, there is a Mecca, but if it's not the big city that everybody's talking about, then there is a problem for the historicity of Mecca. But Muhammad is of Muhammad, because Muhammad is also only mentioned much later, and nobody seems interested in him in the period when he was supposed to have lived.
Odon.
There are things to be understood by referring to external sources also. If you look at the Sibios Chronicle, or pseudo-Sibios Chronicle, so the text dates from around 661.
No.
Or later. It talks about a guy, so-called a preacher named Mahmet, who urges Christian Arabs to conquer the Holy Land, not Mecca, the Holy Land, so the Levant, Palestine, Israel, as their rightful inheritance, since they are sons of Abraham. And if you look into other external sources, other contemporary testimonies of events, of actual events, you see that around 638, Jerusalem was taken by an Arab faction led by people who are described by Jews, and those Arabs and those Jews, or Judeo-Christians, rebuilt the temple, which is a huge event. The third temple has already been rebuilt in Jerusalem. When you really look into it, it's not only one source that tells us about this, but several independent sources. And besides, the Islamic narrative itself tells about a Jewish companion of Umar ibn al-Khattab, building an oratory, a synagogue on the Temple Mount, which is ludicrous. A Jew doesn't build an oratory or something on the Temple Mount. He builds a temple. So something happened in Jerusalem. You don't rebuild the temple in Jerusalem like this lightly. There was something.
Mel.
Yeah, so I think a big thing in the early 7th century is the death of Nehemiah ben Huziel, who's the exilarch. And lo and behold, there's a big Jewish Messianic movement going on. And the earliest source, which is Thomas the Presbyter, refers to the Tayaye de Machmet. Now, there's questions about whether that's from 640 or later, but if we grant that source, what we're talking about is a Messianic movement with a person who has the title of Machmed, the desired one. It's not the name of a person. So that opens the whole thing up. It could be anything, and after that, you know.
Can I just
That's
say
the
something
problem
before
with the
Robert
Thomas-
comes in here? Because Robert's going to shut all of this down. This is why it's so great to have someone of this scholarship here. Because that is right, Mel, we thought this was true until yesterday. So we're going to have to even shut this down. It gets much worse. Go ahead, Robert, over to you.
No, so I'll just pose it, I'll try to be short, I'll just pose the question differently. So if you wanted to write a book on Jesus and the New Testament, good. So birth and the resurrection are faith, not science, but let's say the historical Jesus. How many books do you know that list all the Greek and the Latin sources about Jesus or the early Christians? I don't know any. Nobody seems interested. All of a sudden with Islam we do this and it proves something. But all of these texts, they solve one problem by creating at least two new problems. So Thomas of Presbyter refers to a period where Muhammad was supposed to have been dead for 2 or 3 years. The Chronicle of Sabaeus, and this is these things with Hoyland and others when they do this, sort of when I studied in Germany, they forced us to learn languages and to read texts and not just read the bits in translation that we kind of want to read. If you read Sabaeus, it's a chronicle. We don't have the 7th century chronicle. We have a later chronicle. What happens when you copy chronicles? You update them. It's an automatic phenomenon. When you read the Armenian text with this passage, and we have this in numerous other passages of the manuscript in question, the part preceding and the part succeeding are one continuous text, and they've inserted this thing. It's obviously a later interpolation. But as you said, what do all of these so-called references actually tell us? There's something, some entity called Mahmad, but with all of these things from the 7th century also on the coins, we cannot academically, we're not permitted to use later traditions to interpret, so traditions from the 9th century to interpret things from the 7th century. If on a coin, for example, we just find Mem Kha Mem Dal, Mahmad or Muhammad, it's Mahmad in the 7th century clearly, not Muhammad. The proof is Turkish because you can't get Mehmet in Turkish from Muhammad, but you can get it from Mahmad. Latin, Mahometos, can come from Mahmad, but not from Muhammad. But the point is, if on a coin you just find Mem Kha Mem Dal, what is the problem? Well, when the Arabs here, well, you all know your father's name and your grandfather's name, Ibn, al whatever. It should be Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Abdul Muttalib ibn al-Mekkani or al-Quraishi or something. If you don't find the patronym, it's certainly not a name in Arabic.
Yeah, so another issue is, you know, Muslims might say, well, you have Mahmed on the coin, so it must be Muhammad. But they have a problem because there is an inscription in Najran from 523 with a reference to another Mahmed, and it's connected with the God of the Jews or Lord of the Jews. So the Muhammad solution doesn't work. So I think, again, it points back to a Messianic source for this rather than being a person called Muhammad who comes from the Hijaz.
Can we go to the Quran now?
Yes, we can.
Today is a significant day. Do you all know what today is? June the 8th. What happened 4 years ago today? There you go, folks. We've got to get to the Quran, and we only have 10 minutes. So the last 10 minutes, can we talk about the Quran? Can we talk about what happened 4 years ago? Because every Muslim knows, and this is what impinges on every one of you. Every Muslim knows that the Quran is eternal, right? That's in chapter 85, verse 21 and 22. Every Muslim knows. There you go. Every Muslim knows that it was also preserved. No one could change it. That's in chapter 10, verse 15, and chapter 18, verse 27. And every Muslim knows the reason it cannot be changed is because Allah has guarded it. Chapter 15, verse 9. So it's the Quran that makes these claims. That's why every Muslim makes these claims, including Muhammad Hijab and Yasser Qadi. So what happened 4 years ago what happened 8 years ago when our good friend who should be here today, Hatun Tash, discovered 26 different Qurans. You all know what happened. We held them up, and that caused a crisis in the Islamic world, especially for Muhammad Hijab. And every one of you is going to have to get and understand this argument. So let's open it up about what happened with the Quran in 2020 or 2016.
Who would like to speak on? Chris?
Yeah, sure thing. There has been an understanding for a long time now, at least for many decades, that the Quran is perfectly preserved, letter for letter, word for word, dot for dot. What Muhammad Hijab, for some reason, tried to do with Yasser Qadi is he asked him, look, if I give you a blank Musaf, if I gave you a blank book, what would you write in it of the Quran that is supposedly been perfectly preserved? It's eternal. It's on the preserved tablets. So what would you write? Obviously we have the Quran. Obviously it's been preserved perfectly. So what would you write? And Dr. Yasser Qadi panics and says, don't ask me that. Don't ask me that. Don't ask me that. You know, turn the cameras off. I don't want to talk about this. We'll talk about it later. Even with my students of knowledge, this is something that is challenging. Scholars don't agree on this. You know, Islam is not fully united on this. It's something that he didn't want to talk about at all. And this went viral. And it went viral because of just how embarrassing it was. It was a live stream of this scholar panicking because a Muslim asked him a simple question about the Quran.
Repeatedly.
Repeatedly. And Muhammad Hijab didn't get the clue. It went straight past his head, and he kept pushing for it. And, you know, we still have this footage today. They've taken it down from their YouTube channels and whatnot because they're embarrassed by it. You know, this is what happened 4 years ago. This is a monumental point when many Muslims started to question, hang on a second, I've been told word for word, letter for letter, perfect preservation. Why is this scholar who's an expert at this, if I remember correctly, I think he teaches or he studies at Yale University, he's someone who should know this, and yet he's refusing to tell me. Quite literally saying, I don't want to tell people. This is not something that you bring up with the Ummah. This is for the ulama, it's for the scholars to talk about, not the average Muslim, because the average Muslim, if they knew they had been lied to for decades by people like Yasser Qadi, because he had promoted this as well, then they would probably leave Islam. And hopefully find something much better, faith in our Lord Jesus Christ. And they know this stuff, and that's why it was important.
And just for context, Yasser Qadi came out weeks later absolutely slamming the Christian apologists for misquoting him. Not so sure about that one, Robert.
No, just several things with the Quran and with the transmission. Of course, you know, it's said that the Cairo edition of 1924, 23, 24, is the edition of Uthman. Well, the manuscript's evidence suggests otherwise, but even most Islamic scholars can't read the old Arabic, and they just say, look at it, it looks the same. But on the other hand, even in the Islamic tradition, they know that there are verses missing in the Quran. For example, on how to beat your wife. Well, this snippet of parchment was eaten by a goat. But every Islamic scholar knows exactly what was on this piece of parchment that was unfortunately digested by a goat. So it's quoted.
Can I correct you on that?
Yes.
Actually, to beat your wife is there in chapter 434.
Yeah, no, but
it's feeding your stranger from your breast 10 times that was eaten by the goat.
Okay. All right.
Cool, I think.
Thank you. But you can always concoct any argument you want with a reference to the al-Kitab, the mother book in heaven. So if you don't find it in this Quran, you say, I just happen to know it's upstairs. And you tanzil it, you download it. But the other thing, and I think this is something that at least maybe Christians put too much emphasis on, is so the al-Kitab, the people of the book, the only real book religion is Islam, because this is the actual revelation of God, and in Christianity and Judaism we have a different take. But the interesting thing about Islam is if you look at it closely, the Quran really plays no role in Islam, because all of the doctrine and theology comes from the Sunnah, and it's clear it's been read into the text, so it's not in the text of the Quran as such. It's from the secondary literature imported, which we find in the tafsir. So, for example, to be an imam, all that you need to do is be able to cite Surat al-Fatiha. Well, I pointed out this morning, it's not really part of the Quran, it's the title page, and a short surah, which is usually Surah 112, Allahu as-Samad, and basically you're finished, and that's all you need to do to become an imam. And basically, that's all the Quran you need to know to be a Muslim.
Is it possible to come in? One of the phrases as I recall from that interview is when Sheikh Yasser Qadi talks about the red lines. He says in Muslim conversations, you can discuss this, you can discuss that. In the seminaries or whatever the equivalent is, there is some academic discussion that takes place away from the masses, but even there are red lines, there are areas you know you don't cross. And I think this is absolutely critical. It comes to the very heart of what I think everyone on the stage, and maybe many of you, are about. It's not about red lines, it's about finding the truth. You don't come up to a line and then say, I'm not going beyond there, you go after the truth. And a very important point I think really needs to be made is that nothing we're saying here is anti-Muslim. Muslims are entitled to the truth. My experience is that a great many Muslims have never really read the Quran, or not in any serious depth, not in the depth that you would expect of somebody who thinks it's a word of God directing their lives. A great many Muslims don't know basic facts about the life of Muhammad. Those Muslims who do know the Quran and do know the life of Muhammad, often as not, don't want anyone else to know about it. They will stop that conversation. They will say, let's not talk about this, because they know that there is a motherload of bad stuff there. They have nothing to fear from us. The Quran that we are discovering around this table is not a frightening, scary, horrible, denuded, rubbished Quran. It is a much, much better Quran than the Quran that is taught by the traditional Islamic narrative. It's not surrounded by fanciful tales of nonsense of people leading elephants across deserts. It's not, or next door neighbors leaving thorns in your path. It's not supported by nonsense stories. It's not surrounded by mystery. Oh, why is this verse here? Why this story about Moses and the fish coming alive? Shrug your shoulders, I don't know. Only Allah knows why it's there. No, this is a much better Quran, because it's the Quran that's embedded in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It means something. It might be a little bit, take a bit of unwinding and a bit of untying, but it means something at the end of it. It's got substance. And Muslims have got nothing to fear from the truth. They have a great deal, I think, to fear from holding on to a little understood and essentially bogus story.
Well done.
Yeah, the truth will set you free.
Amen.
So there are absolutely nothing to fear from the truth. And what I would add is the Quran. The Quran is ambiguous in the Islamic mind, because it is supposed to be the very basis of Islam. It's like Jay said, the book and the man. But when you really look into it, it's a trinket. It serves to justify Islam. But there is something much more important for Muslims than the Quran itself, and even than Muhammad. It is Islam, the ideology, the idea that God has chosen Muslims over non-Muslims to rule the world in his stead and to judge mankind in the name of God. And this is, I think, much more important in a Muslim mind than the Quran itself. But most of them are not conscious of this. This is the deep nature of Islam. And it needs the Quran and the Prophet as sort of protections, so that this this ideology, the deep nature of Islam remains uncovered.
So, we've talked a lot about the problematic origins of Mecca, the problematic origins of Muhammad, and now the problematic origins of the Quran. But if I can bring it back to the question for our final question today at this panel, how Islam really began. Here's a question for the entire panel, starting with Paul, and we're going to go around. How far are we from having consensus on the original origins of Islam?
I think around this panel there is a consensus that Jerusalem is hugely important. The Quran talks about a place that is the house of God and would be recognized as a house of God by Abraham, by the patriarchs, by David and Solomon, by Zechariah, Mary, and Jesus. I think there's a consensus that it's all there. There is also, in my opinion, a powerful body of evidence that there was somebody associated with the Quran who was trying to capture Jerusalem and who was using the name Muhammad. My view is if we use Jerusalem to read the Quran, to go back and read the Quran again against where Jerusalem stands in the Christian and the Jewish and Christian tradition, and looking at what was happening in Jerusalem at the precise decades that the Islamic narrative say the Quran was being first put together, I think that it is possible to find patterns, it is possible to find sense in the Quran, and I think we will get there. I think we are getting there.
Jay.
I'm going to go past. Let the others speak, because I'm going to speak tonight on this.
Okay. Robert.
I think in scientific research there is a consensus emerging that Islam, you can only talk about it from the Abbasid period. The Quran plays no role. And it has nothing to do with Muhammad. There's more of a consensus how it didn't happen, how it happened. It's a bit more unclear. But this is part of the problem that we have. So if you look at Islamic studies compared to, for example, biblical studies or even classical studies, there is no critical edition of the Quran, as we heard last evening with the Variae Lectiones of the New Testament or of the Old Testament. We don't have a critical edition of the Quran. We don't have a good historical dictionary of Arabic. So we don't have all of the resources we need yet to get where we need to be. But slowly there is a consensus emerging. So if 10 years ago, a kind of panel discussion like this would have been more controversial. So there is a consensus emerging that it has nothing to do originally with either with Muhammad, Mecca, or the Quran.
So how far are we from a consensus?
On the original origins of Islam.
I think there will never be a consensus because there are some very powerful forces that don't want to hurt Islam. So, of course, Muslims themselves, but other forces also. And so, because of this, there will never be a consensus, but it doesn't matter because the truth is not a matter of consensus. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of truth. And the people of goodwill will recognize the truth. Our role is to proclaim it.
Mel.
I think there are some broad brushstrokes that we can make, even if there's not a full consensus, which is there is a conquest in the 7th century. It is led by Arabs, but there's no sense of Islam being there. And I think whenever you look at the data from any angle you like, it always seems to point to the Levantine area, Syria, Iraq. And if you look at the centers of power from then onwards, you're talking about places like Baghdad and Kufa, and it's got nothing to do with Mecca and Medina until way later.
Chris?
Yeah, I'm willfully positive that, well, at least in the next few decades, there'll be substantial changes in how we perceive this. I think we do have to distinguish, like you did, Odin, between wider scholarship, which I think is still, in many ways, largely embedded to the standard Islamic narrative and is unwilling to give a lot of that up, and also just between those who are just more critical. Because even those who are critical, we still have to put together our different ideas and try to come up with like a holistic understanding of the origins of Islam, of the origins of the Quran, what actually is it. And yeah, I'm silently hopeful that we'll actually come to that in the next few decades, hopefully.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for this. Thank you for this panel.